For decades, Sean Hannity has been the man who never flinched, a master of confrontation, armed with facts, fire, and an unshakable sense of conviction. Every night, millions tuned in to see him challenge politicians, expose scandals, and dissect the latest controversies with surgical precision. He was confident, unbreakable, almost untouchable. But then, out of nowhere, the tone changed. It wasn't during one of his usual fiery monologues or political debates. There were no flashing graphics or dramatic headlines, just Hannity, his voice softer than usual, reflecting in a way few had ever seen. He began talking about gratitude, the people who stand by you when life gets messy. And then came the words that froze his audience. I found the love of my life. For a man who'd built his entire career behind a wall of composure, that single sentence hit harder than any political punch he'd ever thrown. It wasn't just a confession, it was a revelation. The internet exploded with questions. Who was he talking about? Why now? And more importantly, what changed? For years, fans had only seen one side of Sean Hannity, the relentless broadcaster, the debater who never backed down. But this moment peeled back the armor. Suddenly, America wasn't looking at the commentator, was looking at the man, a man who, at 63, was finally ready to admit something more powerful than politics, that love had found him again. And yet, behind that quiet confession was a story decades in the making, one built on ambition, sacrifice, heartbreak, and rediscovery. The story of how one of the toughest voices in American media learned that even the strongest among us can still be changed by love. But to understand how he got there, you first have to know where he started. Before the headlines, before Fox News. Before the spotlight turned his name into a brand, Sean Hannity was just a kid from Queens, with big dreams and calloused hands. He was the youngest of four, raised in a working-class Irish-American family where hard work wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. His father served as a court officer, his mother worked as a corrections officer, and together they taught him that nothing worth having comes easy. By the age of 12, Hannity was already scrubbing dishes in restaurant kitchens. A year later, he was flipping burgers, bussing tables, painting houses, anything that paid enough to keep moving forward. There was no silver spoon, no shortcuts. Every dollar he made came from sweat and stubbornness. That relentless work ethic would become the engine that powered his entire life. But somewhere between the clatter of dishes and the smell of fresh paint, something else began to stir in him. Late at night, while his friends were asleep, Hannity would lie in bed listening to talk radio. Those voices, commanding, opinionated, alive-lit, a spark he couldn't ignore. They weren't just talking. They were shaping conversations across the country. And that fascinated him. He didn't know it then, but those sleepless nights were the beginning of something bigger. The rhythm of radio, the passion behind every word, it drew him in. He started dreaming about having a microphone of his own, about building a platform where his voice could matter. By his early 20s, Hannity had tried just about every job he could find: construction worker, house painter, but nothing felt right. None of it gave him that sense of purpose he felt when he listened to those radio hosts who could turn words into influence. And so, when he stumbled across a tiny college radio station in California looking for volunteers, he didn't hesitate. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't pay, but it was everything he'd been searching for. Standing behind that microphone for the first time, he felt something click. This wasn't just a job, it was destiny calling through static. From that point on, Hannity was unstoppable. The boy from Queens was about to build a career that would take him from a small California booth to one of the biggest stages in American media. But with ambition that fierce, there's always a cost, and the climb to fame would soon test everything he believed in. That small radio booth in California was the spark that lit the fire. Once Sean Hannity found his voice behind that microphone, there was no going back. He poured everything he had into perfecting his craft. The pacing, the tone, the conviction. He wasn't just talking. He was connecting, challenging, provoking thought. And in an era where radio still ruled the conversation, that was power. His rise wasn't overnight, but it was relentless. He went from that tiny college station to larger markets in Alabama and Georgia, grinding through long hours, low pay, and endless pressure. Each broadcast sharpened him, each debate built his presence. And people started to notice. Producers recognized something in Hannity that couldn't be taught: energy that filled the airwaves and made you stop what you were doing just to listen. The timing couldn't have been better. America was entering a new age of political talk shows where opinion wasn't just commentary, it was entertainment. Networks wanted voices that could polarize, provoke, and pull audiences in. Hannity fit that mold perfectly. He was bold, fast, and unapologetic. Then came the call that would change everything. In 1996, Fox News, a fledgling network looking to make its mark, offered him a spot as co-host on a new show. It was called Hannity and Combs, pairing his fiery conservative energy with liberal commentator Alan Colmes. The tension between the two wasn't just television, it was electricity. Viewers couldn't look away. The show exploded, and Hannity became a household name. He didn't just argue, he owned the room. Every debate, every headline, every clash of ideology built his reputation as one of the most commanding voices in the country. Soon after, the Sean Hannity Show launched on radio, catapulting him even higher. Presidents sought interviews. Politicians feared his questions. And fans, they worshipped his conviction. But behind the spotlight, the fame, and the long nights in the studio, something else was happening, something quieter. The same drive that built his empire was also isolating him. Long hours turned into longer weeks, and the pressure to stay on top left little room for anything else. For the public, he was untouchable. But in private, the man who could control any conversation was slowly losing control of his own life. And that's where the story turns, because while Sean Hannity's career soared, his personal world began to crack in ways no one saw coming. Long before the tabloids, the headlines, or the whispers of new love, Sean Hannity was simply a man in love with a woman named Jill Rhodes. It was the early 1990s, and he was still grinding his way through small-town radio, hungry for recognition but grounded by something far more real. Jill was a young journalist working at a local newspaper in Huntsville, Alabama, smart, sharp, and driven in her own way. When she first heard Hannity's voice on air, she didn't know she was listening to the man who'd one day change her life. Their connection began professionally phone calls about story tips, local coverage, community updates. But those calls became longer, warmer, more personal. Two ambitious people, chasing dreams in the same world, found comfort in each other's chaos. By 1993, they were married. It wasn't a spectacle, no flashing cameras or celebrity guests, just two people, deeply in love, ready to take on the future together. As Hannity's career began to take off, Jill became his steady anchor. While the world saw the fiery commentator, she saw the man who still remembered his humble roots, the man who wanted to provide, protect, and keep his family grounded. Together, they raised two children, Patrick and Mary, building a quiet family life away from the cameras. But fame has a way of testing even the strongest foundations. The endless schedules, the travel, the constant pressure to stay relevant, it all began to take its toll. The same drive that fueled his success started creating distance at home. What once felt like balance slowly turned into exhaustion, and though they tried to hold on, the cracks began to show. By 2019, after more than 2 decades of marriage, they made a decision few saw coming. The split wasn't loud. There were no public statements, no bitter accusations, no courtroom drama. Just two people who had grown in different directions deciding to let go quietly, respectfully, and with grace. Even after the divorce, Hannity and Jill kept one promise to each other. Their kids would always come first. Friends say he never missed a tennis match, a graduation, or a milestone. And through it all, he remained protective of his family, refusing to let fame turn his personal life into gossip fodder. But behind that composure was something else, a quiet ache. The man who could debate presidents and command millions of viewers suddenly found himself wrestling with something he couldn't. Control, the emptiness of a love lost. And in that silence, something changed. For the first time in years, Sean Hannity stopped fighting the noise of the world and started listening to himself. When the cameras turned off and the audience disappeared, Sean Hannity was left with something unfamiliar, quiet. For a man who'd spent decades living in the noise of breaking news and constant debate, silence felt heavy. His marriage was over, his home life had changed, and the world he once controlled through headlines suddenly seemed uncertain. But instead of spiraling, Hannity retreated into something that had always grounded him: faith. Those who knew him say he became almost monk-like in routine. Early mornings started with workouts, followed by prayer, reflection, and then hours of relentless work. He filled his time with structure, discipline, and gratitude, the tools he knew best to keep chaos away. He wasn't chasing reinvention, he was searching for peace. For years, Hannity's career had demanded intensity. Every night he was expected to perform, to be sharp, decisive, unbreakable. But now, off camera, he allowed himself to slow down. He reconnected with old friends, focused on his kids, and quietly started appreciating life's simplest moments: a Sunday meal, a long drive, a phone call that didn't have to end in an argument. Yet even in that calm, loneliness lingered. The man who had millions of listeners tuning in each day, didn't he have anyone to share the silence with when the microphones went off? Colleagues noticed he'd grown quieter, more reflective. His tone softened, his laughter came less often but meant more when it did. He no longer chased headlines about himself. In fact, he avoided them completely. There were no public outings, no dating rumors, no splashy events, just work, faith, and family. It was as if Hannity had built a fortress around his personal life, strong, orderly, and impenetrable. But behind that discipline was a simple truth he couldn't ignore. Success had given him everything except the one thing that made it all feel complete. Still, in his heart, something was shifting. Not the loud, dramatic kind of change he was used to, but a quiet one. The kind that sneaks up on you when you least expect it. Because somewhere in the same building where he worked every day, someone else was walking a similar path. Someone who knew the same pain of loss, the same pull of faith, and the same desire to rebuild. And when their worlds finally crossed, neither of them could have predicted what would happen next. In the world of television, people cross paths every day. Anchors, producers, camera crews, all orbiting the same chaotic universe of breaking news and tight deadlines. But some connections stand out. Sean Hannity and Ainsley Earhart had worked in the same building for years, exchanging polite hellos, sharing the occasional laugh between segments. But nothing more than professional respect. At least, not at first. Ainsley was no stranger to the spotlight. Born and raised in South Carolina, she had carved her own name in the fast-paced world of broadcast journalism. With her warm presence and steady optimism, she became one of Fox's most beloved morning hosts. But behind the bright smile was a woman who had weathered storms of her own to failed marriages, heartbreak, and the challenges of raising her daughter Hayden as a single mum. Her faith became her compass, guiding her through uncertainty and reminding her that even broken roads can lead somewhere beautiful. It was that shared faith that first drew her and Hannity closer. Both had lived through loss. Both had learned that success means little if you have no one to share it with. Conversations that once revolved around work began to stretch into something more personal about family, belief, and second chances. Whispers began to spread quietly through the network's hallways. They were seen together at company events, leaving studios side by side, sharing easy smiles that felt different, warmer, genuine. Still, neither of them confirmed anything. Hannity, always protective of his privacy, stayed silent, and Ainsley, deeply mindful of her young daughter, guarded her heart carefully. Reports claim their friendship began to deepen over time. They started attending church together, often sitting quietly in the back, blending in with the congregation. It wasn't the flashy kind of romance the tabloids craved, no red carpets, no public displays, but something more grounded, something real. For Hannity, Ainsley brought calm where there had once been chaos. She reminded him that faith and grace could exist even in the harsh world of cable news. And for Ainsley Hannity's loyalty and steadiness offered safety, a rare thing in an industry built on pressure and performance. People who worked with them noticed subtle changes. Hannity laughed more. His tone was lighter. He seemed content. And Ainsley, too, glowed in a quiet, unmistakable way, like someone rediscovering joy after years of endurance. Neither of them needed to label it. Their bond spoke for itself to people who had been through the fire and somehow found peace in each other's company. But then came the moment that changed everything, the one sentence that turned quiet rumors into nationwide speculation. It wasn't during one of Sean Hannity's trademark monologues, the kind that sets social media ablaze and dominates headlines for days. There was no political drama, no fiery debate, just an ordinary night on air that suddenly turned into something unforgettable. His voice was calm, softer than anyone was used to hearing. Instead of launching into policy or controversy, Hannity began talking about gratitude. About how, after everything he'd been through, he'd learned to value the people who stood beside him when life wasn't easy. Viewers leaned in, expecting the usual political pivot. But what came next caught everyone completely off guard. Almost casually, almost as if he didn't mean to reveal it. Hannity said he'd found the love of my life. The studio went quiet. There was a pause, the kind that only happens when truth hangs heavy in the air. For a man known for iron control, it was the first real crack in the armor. There was no script, no media spin, just honesty. And for a moment, the country's most unshakable voice sounded human. He didn't name anyone. He didn't have to. Those who had followed his story, the shared church visits, the glances during broadcasts, the quiet warmth on set, knew exactly who he was talking about. The timing, the tone, the sincerity in his eyes. Everything pointed to Ainsley, EARHARDT. Clips of the moment went viral within hours. Headlines called it Hannity's heartfelt confession. Fans were stunned, not just by the words, but by what they revealed about the man behind them. This was Sean Hannity, stripped of debate and defense. Speaking as someone who'd finally stopped running from his emotions. For years, he had been the personification of control, every sentence deliberate, every argument airtight. But that night, none of that mattered. The look in his eyes said everything. Gone was the political warrior. In his place stood a man at peace with vulnerability, speaking from a place of quiet gratitude. He smiled as he said it, a small, knowing smile that carried more weight than any headline. At this stage in my life, he said, I'm just grateful. I found someone who makes me better every single day. That single line changed how millions saw him. It softened the sharp edges of his persona, revealing a depth most never expected. For the first time, people weren't tuning in to hear what Hannity thought about the world. They were hearing what the world had taught him about love. And just like that, the man who'd built a career on commanding every conversation became the story everyone was talking about. The moment Sean Hannity's confession aired, the ripple effect was instant. Within hours, clips were spreading across social media, reactions pouring in from every corner of the internet. Some fans were stunned. Others were moved. And even his critics, the ones who had spent years clashing with his politics, paused to acknowledge something they rarely saw in the media world: raw sincerity. Commentators dissected every frame of the broadcast. The tone of his voice, the timing, even the way he smiled after saying it. Was it a planned revelation or an unguarded moment of truth? Whatever it was, it didn't feel like strategy. It felt real. Viewers who had followed him for decades said it was like seeing a new side of someone they thought they already knew. The unshakable host who once dominated political discourse had suddenly shown the most human part of himself, the side that wasn't about ratings, power, or control. It wasn't a statement meant to stir debate. It was a confession meant to be felt. The media, of course, couldn't resist the story. Headlines screamed speculation about his relationship with Ainsley Earhart, digging through every old photo and public appearance for proof. But even as the tabloids chased details, something deeper resonated with people. It wasn't about who he loved, it was about the courage it took to admit it. In an era where authenticity often feels like performance, Hannity's vulnerability stood out. It wasn't polished or rehearsed. It was the kind of honesty that reminded viewers that behind every public figure there's still a person who hurts, heals, and hopes just like anyone else. For his supporters, it made him more relatable than ever. They saw a man who had spent decades fighting for what he believed in, finally learning to stop fighting everything else. For his colleagues, it showed growth, a softer, wiser Hannity, who no longer needed to prove his strength through defiance, but through honesty. And for Hannity himself, it seemed to mark a quiet turning point. The guardedness that once defined him began to fade. He smiled more freely. His on-air tone, while still sharp and focused, carried a calm beneath the conviction. It was as if, after years of standing at the center of America's loudest arguments, he'd finally found peace in something much simpler: Because for all the speculation, all the headlines and theories, the real story wasn't about who Sean Hannity was with, it was about who he had become. And as the world debated his words, one truth became impossible to ignore. Love had changed him completely. For most of his life, Sean Hannity was defined by noise, the debates, the headlines, the nightly rush of adrenaline that comes from being one of America's most polarizing voices. But his quiet confession revealed something far more powerful than any on-air moment ever could. That even the loudest lives need silence, and even the toughest hearts crave softness. At 63, Hannity didn't reinvent himself, he simply let himself be seen, not as the relentless commentator or the political heavyweight, but as a man who had finally learned the difference between success and peace. His confession wasn't a media stunt or a grand performance. It was the sound of someone who had fought every external battle imaginable, finally facing the one within and winning it in that moment. All the noise that had once defined him faded into something purer: gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons that came with loss, for the grace that came with time, and for the rare chance to experience love, not in youth's urgency, but in maturity's calm. There's something universal about that. Everyone, at some point, faces the quiet after the storm. That space where you're forced to decide whether to close your heart or open it again. Hannity chose to open his carrot, and whether the world agreed with his politics or not, they couldn't deny the humanity of that decision. His story became less about controversy and more about courage, the courage to change, to feel, to start again when life seems already written. It reminded people that love doesn't follow a schedule or a script. It arrives when you least expect it. Sometimes after heartbreak. Sometimes after decades of solitude. But always right on time. And perhaps that's what made his confession so striking. It wasn't about a man finding love. It was about love finding him. About realizing that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's wisdom earned the hard way. So, when Sean Hannity said he'd found the love of my life, it wasn't just a confession. It was a quiet promise that even in a world full of division, cynicism, and endless noise, the simplest truths still matter. Because at the end of every argument, every headline, and every debate, the one thing that always remains undefeated is love.